Hi folks, I'm back. I'm going to try and make this video a lot shorter actually than the previous one. I know that first one was long. But in the previous video, we talked about the indigenous heritage of Africa. They did have a history, um, and they had kings, rulers, leaders. They had warriors who led vast armies into battle. They had artists, artisans, craftsmen who made implements of war, tools of agriculture. They created sculptures, bronzes, um, pots, various things. And anyway, so they did have that rich cultural, social, and political history before the Arabs and the Europeans showed up. But here we're going to talk about the Arabic influence on the continent. And I'm not sure exactly when the Arabs made contact with the African continent. That's not important. But when they did, they brought certain influences to the continent that over a period of time began to change the certain parts of the African continent. So if you go to North Africa, like I said in the previous section, you'll see it's very heavily influenced by Arabic culture. But the further south you go, the less of that influence you'll see, although it's still there. But some of the things they brought to the African continent were obviously the Islamic religion, which had a tremendous effect in certain regions, and so you'll see pockets of Africa that are primarily Islamic. And they also brought Arabic languages like Swahili, which isn't actually an Arabic language. It's a mixture. It's a hybrid of African and Arabic languages, and I'll talk about that in a second. They influenced the architecture of Africa, particularly along the coasts. They did bring a different form of slavery. Africans practiced slavery before the Arabs and the Europeans showed up. They did enslave one another from within and without their own cultures for various reasons. But the Arabs introduced a different form of slavery. And they introduced trade items, which I'm going to talk about, but it's primarily things like spices and cloves, cinnamon, things like that. And then they also influenced various aspects of their culture, their music, the clothing, art, and the cuisine. Oops, didn't want to do that. I want to do this. So here we see West Africa. And these are some of the ancient trade at the time of the Mali Empire, which we talked about in the previous video. And here are some of the ancient trade routes that led into the continent. When the Arabs first made contact with the African continent, they primarily came down in dhows, their ships, along with the monsoon winds, or maybe they returned with the monsoon winds, I don't remember. But they would primarily come down along the coast and begin to settle, create these kind of port cities along the West African coast as well as the East African coast, which we can't see here. So if you go along the coast, if you were ever to go along the coast of Africa, you will see a lot of Arabic influence on those particularly those coastal cities. But they eventually made their way inland. Here is Tagaza, which had salt mines. I don't know if they still do have salt mines there. I'm guessing they do. But that was one of the primary interests in the slavery. But they were also interested in other things, the Arabs, like, as I said, slaves, ivory, bronze, copper, iron ore, the products that the Africans produced, like I said, implements of war, and pottery and stuff like that. And so there was this kind of mutual trade between Africans and Arabs over the centuries. And as I said, these are some of those trade routes that you see to the Mali Empire. So you can't see that because my head is in the way. Here we go. I don't know if that's going to work or not. I'm trying to move the video. But they primarily want some of the things that they brought, the Arabs, were spices like cloves, vanilla, cumin, dal, which isn't a spice, but It's a legume. But they've brought various different items for trade with Africans. And so they began to influence the culture in many ways. And one of the primary ways was through the Arabic slave trade, which was different than what Africans practiced, but it wasn't nearly as violent as the European slave trade. We'll get into that later in the semester, particularly when you watch a documentary called The Tools of Exploitation. Dr. Ali Mazrui goes into detail about the difference between the Arabic and the European slave trade. So I'll save that information for later. But they did influence the architecture. Here is a mosque in East Africa. And you can see this building. I don't know what this building is in the background, but obviously influenced by Arabic culture and architecture. As I said, they influenced the language, and Swahili, as I said, is a hybrid language. These are some of the words in Swahili, the more familiar words. And if you've seen The Lion King, you probably recognize a couple of these. Jambo means hello. When you greet somebody, you might say habari gani, which is what is the news, and your response would be mazuri sana. Kwaheri means goodbye, and you might recognize the last one there. Hakuna matata, no problem. So Swahili architecture, this is typical of what you might see on the coast, but you also see this kind of architecture in the interior of Africa. It's these lattices, kind of lattice work, I don't know what you would call that, but the arches as well. And you'd see a lot of this, as I said, on the coast, but as well in the interior. They influenced Swahili cuisine, primarily through those spices, but they also introduced things like lentils, rice, and it began to influence certain aspects of their culture. It didn't influence all of Africa. The Maasai, I showed you a photo of them earlier. They still live their traditional lifestyle, and they don't. Their cuisine is definitely not influenced by the Arabic cuisine or Asian cuisine. Here you see traditional Fulani clothing from Nigeria, and you see the kind of the garments that they're wearing, and the headgear is influenced by Islam. But you also see these guys. This guy's wearing jeans, slacks, and shoes, sunglasses. All of that is West. So it's a mixture of cultures. But the Fulani are primarily Islamic. And here you see, I don't know if she would be in traditional. She looks like she might be more traditional. I have no idea. I'm just speculating. So I'm going to stop there, and that was much shorter, 8 minutes. And I'm going to ask you to provide in the box below. Type in any questions you might have about the Arabic influence on the continent. Any comments, anything that you want clarified, and I will respond to your comments as promptly as I can.